Good morning, everybody. I'll try that again like the minister in church. Good morning, everybody. We're delighted to have you back for day 2 of our annual Tech Symposium. We have a terrific agenda today, and we look forward to more engagement. I think yesterday was really marked by a tremendous number of questions, many of which we just ran out of time to have presented and asked, and great presenters. So we look very much forward to a very rich day today. So I'm Kevin Knobloch. I'm the Acting Executive Director of the National Offshore Wind Research and Development Consortium, at least for another few weeks, and really privileged to be associated with this wonderful organization, and I'm glad you all are as well. So we have this tremendous opening keynote panel that we're going to kick today off with, and I'll introduce our panelists briefly in just a moment. The session description: this keynote will feature industry professionals that work at the intersection of offshore wind policy and research and development. The panel will examine how these two overlapping sectors of the industry can successfully work together to move the whole industry forward. And the goal that we set for our panel is to show the NOWRDC project PIs and associated teams how their existing and future work might connect with regional offshore wind policy and goals. So an ambitious topic today. So we're delighted to feature the following speakers, starting from my left. Jen Daloisio, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. To her left, Stephanie Watson, who is the Offshore Wind Program Manager for the state of Maine, Governor's Energy Office. And then to her left, Susannah Hatch, who's the Director of Clean Energy Policy for the Environmental League of Massachusetts. So I have an opening question for each of our panelists. Where's Corey? Do we have the opportunity to ask questions from the audience? No. Okay. I'm not an IT whiz. I'm all thumbs. And so I was so impressed that I figured out how to ask the questions online yesterday. So I was kind of hoping. So the question, for the overarching question is, for your organizations, what are the highest priority offshore wind technical challenges? So Jen, if you would, please discuss Mass CEC's approach to offshore wind technology and systems management development and how that guides the grants that you make.
Good morning. Thank you so much for allowing me to be here today. I'm really excited to talk with you all. So for those of you that don't know Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, we're an economic development agency in the state of Massachusetts, and our goal is to grow the clean energy industry here in Massachusetts, but also to help us meet our ambitious climate goals. We do that work in a number of ways. One of them is to further the commercially ready technology. So how can we take commercially ready technologies and increase the pace and the scale of adoption? Another way that we work is in workforce development. How can we ensure that we have the diverse and equitable workforce that has the skills and the training necessary to participate in this new industry? And then finally, research and innovation. How can we further innovation and technology development to get those innovations that we will need in order to meet our climate goals? So as it relates to offshore wind, we really focus on fostering that innovation culture that we have here in Massachusetts, supporting research that helps us to achieve those ambitious climate goals. When I think about the near term, I think about the deployment for the first Vineyard Wind project that's happening in the offshore construction is happening in January. So we really think about deployment logistics, met-ocean data collection, some joint projects that we have with Vineyard Wind in terms of supply chain, and really the wildlife and fisheries impacts. So those are kind of the near-term focus areas for us. And then as we think about the longer term, which I know we'll get into more, is really the Gulf of Maine transmission and grid integration, and really that long-term monitoring and success metrics that we need to collect for our offshore wind projects.
Thank you, Jen. Stephanie. The state of Maine is focused on Phase 2 offshore wind development challenges regarding floating and future technologies. Could you talk about that focus as well as the purpose of the new Maine Research Consortium?
Sure. Thanks, Kevin. Can everyone hear me? Okay, great. I'm the Offshore Wind Program Manager in the Governor's Energy Office in the state of Maine. We are the lead agency for the state's offshore wind activities. We work closely with our sister agencies in the state as well as our neighboring states, regional entities, federal agencies, and key partners like NOWRDC. We are focused on floating offshore wind. This is due to a number of different factors, including the deeper waters that we have in the Gulf of Maine, as well as our maritime experience in the state and over a decade of state planning with floating offshore wind and University of Maine R&D with offshore wind in the floating space. The university has won more than $50 million from US DOE, NSF, NOWRDC, ARPA-E, and others, as well as $100 million in private investment to develop the semi-submersible floating offshore wind technology with a concrete hull. They're also developing the deep sea floating LiDAR to measure offshore wind at hub height, as well as mooring designs that minimize the spatial footprint on the seafloor, and a world-class wind and wave testing facility. We have over 70 patents to date and employ more than 45 personnel. We are also on the state government side. Our R&D activities are focusing on the unique challenges of floating offshore wind, which include deployment in deeper waters, further offshore, and include minimizing the impacts on our existing ocean users and the unique characteristics of the Gulf of Maine ecosystem. When we're talking about offshore wind in the state of Maine, it's very important for us to continue to support our very important fisheries industries. They are an economic engine for us, providing more than $3 billion to our economy every year, as well as serving a really important role in our cultural fabric of our state. So that responsible offshore wind development is really important to us, as well as it's important to other states as well, but our fisheries interest is a very unique part of our work. So we have two principal R&D activities that we are working on as a state. These include the Floating Offshore Wind Research Array and the Maine Offshore Wind Research Consortium, which Kevin just mentioned. The Floating Offshore Wind Research Array, in 2021, we submitted a research lease application to BOEM for a floating array in federal waters of the Gulf of Maine. The proposal includes up to 12 floating turbines, up to 144 megawatts total, using the University of Maine's semi-submersible technology with the support of RWE and Diamond Offshore Wind. So that application is currently pending with BOEM, and we have the state legislature's authorization to negotiate a power purchase agreement for that project and our partners. The second primary R&D piece for the state is our State Offshore Wind Research Consortium. Also in 2021, our legislature directed the Governor's Energy Office to establish a State Offshore Wind Research Consortium and provided funding for that effort. There are two unique characteristics of that consortium, our focus on floating and also our focus on the Gulf of Maine system. It's important to us that this consortium is additive, that it complements the work of existing entities like NOWRDC, the Responsible Offshore Science Alliance, and the Regional Wildlife Science Collaborative, for example, and that we contribute to the collective knowledge on offshore wind. That consortium is currently in the planning stages at this point, and we hope to have it established in 2023.
Thank you, Stephanie. As a general rule, if you can pull the mics in fairly snug, because we're also broadcasting out to our 450 virtual participants today. Thank you. Susannah, Environmental League of Massachusetts spearheaded the creation of New England for Offshore Wind, a coalition of research universities, NGOs, organized labor, and the business community. Have innovation priorities emerged from the coalition deliberations?
Yes, thank you, Kevin, and great to be here with all of you. So Environmental League of Massachusetts, I'll just introduce both of the entities that Kevin just described in a little bit more detail. The Environmental League of Massachusetts, otherwise known as ELM, is a 124-year-old environmental policy organization. We work at the intersection of policy and politics to secure the health and well-being of the environment and of future generations. And in my role as Director of Clean Energy Policy at the Environmental League of Massachusetts, I'm also the regional lead for the New England for Offshore Wind Coalition, which Kevin mentioned. It's a coalition that launched in 2020, a regional coalition of over 100 member organizations of ENGOs, businesses, labor unions, academic institutions, you name it, a very broad-based regional coalition. And our aim is to drive regional collaboration and increased procurements of responsibly developed offshore wind. And all of our advocacy around offshore wind centers around our core values, which speak to respect and responsibility. So that includes responsibility to the environment and to wildlife, as well as inclusive and meaningful stakeholder engagement and community engagement. We also strive for science-based decision-making. So of course, this room right here is key to making sure that we are using science to achieve the best results possible. And then we also are focused on making sure that we're driving equity and economic justice as we're advocating for offshore wind across New England. We have a number of different priorities. I mentioned already aiming to drive regional collaboration. You know, one of the things that many of you in this room are already aware of is that this is a global market, and so it's really important that our states, especially in our region, but even outside of our region, collaborate so that we're able to compete in that global market and get the best results possible. We're aiming to get states to increase their commitments to offshore wind, which has been the real driver for the market here in the US. And then we're also focused on getting innovative solutions for transmission to unlock offshore wind, as well as getting projects over the finish line, of course. You know, there's only so much that we can do as far as increasing targets if we can't get these projects built and in the water. So that's another thing that we're really focused on. And as far as priorities for innovation, a lot of what you know we would prioritize is very in line with what I just said. As far as our core values, where really some of the things that we see as the most important are protection of wildlife and research and innovation that helps increase that coexistence for both wildlife and fisheries. We also see a lot of need for innovation and research in transmission to both decrease the community as well as the environmental impacts, as well as helping reduce costs and maximizing the power that is able to be carried on transmission lines. And then lastly, the environmental justice is a really critical issue as well. Obviously, you know, that sounds like a non-technical issue, but there are some technical things that really speak to environmental justice, including ports and supply chain development, and making sure that we're really minimizing impacts to those communities that have already borne disproportionate impacts from the energy system. So those are, you know, top three, and I'm sure I will talk more about them later.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Susannah. Each of you really, in your mission and the programmatic work in the offshore wind space, you really are establishing that offshore wind is a critical piece of the puzzle. So I want to ask you to take a half step back in terms of the overall effort to transition to a clean energy economy, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions at the scale that we need to. Where does, from your perspective and your organization's perspective, where does offshore wind fit into that puzzle, and then by extension, the need for innovation? Jen?
Sure, I'll start. So in Massachusetts, we have a really ambitious set of climate goals. That's a 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and a net zero by 2050. So offshore wind is really the centerpiece of our energy strategy. We have 5.6 gigawatts that is authorized, and our 2050 roadmap tells us that we'll need about 15 to 20 gigawatts at a minimum of offshore wind to meet our state needs and to meet those ambitious climate goals. So that is really how, you know, offshore wind kind of fits into the Massachusetts ecosystem. But in particular, our interest in research and development we know that there's further innovation and technology development that's needed. There's work to do with making sure that our fisheries communities are taken care of and that we are monitoring and assessing the impacts on both the wildlife, the fisheries communities, as well as the environmental impacts. And really with the larger distances that we'll have in the United States from shore, the larger turbines that have come now into play, and really that remote monitoring and maintenance. But we see this as a key area for Massachusetts. We have such a great history of innovation in this state, a lot of really great academic institutions, and there are a lot of really excellent partnerships here that are working on all of these problems, some of which have been mentioned today. NOWRDC is one of them, and another one is Power US in the Massachusetts area that we're really focused on. We're currently conducting a feasibility study for an ocean energy innovation center on the south coast of Massachusetts, and that's another area where we're looking to determine if if it's feasible to have an innovation center that comes and is really fostering a lot more of this innovation and research. And really that will help us grow the ecosystem and the economic development engine here in the state as well.
Thank you, Jen. Steph?
Okay, great. Like Massachusetts, we have some very ambitious clean energy goals. We have a renewable energy market assessment that was performed for us a couple of years ago that is to get us towards 80% of renewable generation for our electricity by 2030 and 100% by 2050. We are relatively on target for the 80% by 2030. But to reach the target of 2050, we need to add new renewable energy sources. And we are looking at multiple renewable energy sources, including solar, onshore wind, and offshore wind. In terms of offshore wind, we've done some additional analyses that indicate that we will need that offshore wind to meet our targets in the longer term. And we also recognize that we are sharing the Gulf of Maine ecosystem with neighboring states, Massachusetts and New Hampshire, as well as our neighbors in Atlantic Canada. And in the United States, we have some additional regional energy demands and goals that will need to be served by the Gulf of Maine and offshore wind. So offshore wind is a key component to our work, especially in the long term for Maine and important for the region now. We are trying to do a number of things, looking at trying to improve the efficiency and reliability of our grid, and engaged in the RFI for New England to look at better ways we can coordinate regionally on transmission and some other pieces related to that. So it's still a very important part of our renewable energy mix. And we don't have an actual target yet, but we are hoping to in the future.
Excellent. Susannah?
Yeah, so climate change really drives our interest in offshore wind, as I'm sure it does many folks in the room. As both Jen and Stephanie mentioned, there are really ambitious and science-driven state goals in all states in New England. Put on my New England for Offshore Wind hat to say that all but one of the states have requirements to reduce emissions by 2050 by at least 80%. Massachusetts is 85%. And there have been a lot of studies, as Jen referenced, that have shown that Massachusetts and all of New England are going to need a ton of offshore wind in order to get there, due to our demographics and our geography, and of course due to the conditions off our shores as well. Part of our interest is also recognizing that this is not only a critical climate solution, but also an enormous opportunity for our region for economic development and the creation of high quality jobs in our region, including for New England's unionized workforce. We also are an advocacy organization for offshore wind. Part of our interest in research and development for offshore wind is really because we see that as critical to the success of this industry, which is needed to combat climate change, and that R&D will be really important to making sure that not only the industry is successful, but that we get it right. And as far as how it fits in, just to tie back to climate change in your question, Kevin, as far as how it fits in, part of the reason that it is really important is that as we are moving towards these climate goals and implementing more renewable energy, and especially decarbonizing our buildings, we're going to need more power, particularly in the winter. And offshore wind is a really strong resource for the winter as far as reliability and capacity. So it's going to be a really critical piece of the puzzle alongside solar and other renewable energy, including energy efficiency. Offshore wind is going to be a really key piece of the puzzle for us to get there.
Thank you. I want to talk a little bit about the role of offshore wind in the economic development of, in this instance, we have Maine, Massachusetts, and then all of New England with Susannah's focus. One of the cool things about the R&D space is the number of early stage and startup companies that are engaged, and also the big strategics. We have GE Renewables and Hitachi and a whole range of other companies. The big, primarily European offshore wind developers, and so on and so forth, tier 1, tier 2 companies. All coming together, often on these project teams that win these awards and are pursuing solving these problems together. So my question is, from your geographical context, how do you think about the role of innovation in company creation and in growth and in economic development?
Great, thank you. So I think we have built this really great ecosystem here in Massachusetts, this clean energy hub, and a big part of that has been that innovation and that company development. A lot of the work that we do is helping companies all the way from the research stages to commercial operation. So we have technology development programs that are able to support companies at various stages in their growth, and also to help them develop the workforce that they need. So a key area for that is really, we have this vibrant network. So if you think about Greentown Labs is one of the largest incubators in the country for clean energy. You may have seen last week in the news, the Prince and Princess of Wales visited Greentown Labs. So it really is a real hub for innovation and technology development. And we have Sea Ahead here in Massachusetts as well. So there's really this ecosystem that we're trying to drive here. Again, the real reason CEC was created was to help take all of these innovations and the research coming out of these academic institutions and to help bring a support and a kind of a hub here so that these companies were able to grow and thrive. And in addition, that brings jobs and economic development. A third piece that I would mention is that we have another ecosystem here with the New England Aquarium and WHOI and other supportive organizations here in this area that really help to bring, in particular, the blue and offshore wind innovation economy to Massachusetts. So it's really all about this kind of creation of this fostering ecosystem here, which we're really good at in Massachusetts.
In Maine, we are in the process of developing a Maine offshore wind roadmap, which is funded by the U.S. Economic Development Administration. And the overall goal of that roadmap is to determine how Maine can thoughtfully participate in the offshore wind sector to bring benefits to the state and to the region. Part of that roadmap effort, we have several different expert working groups, one of which is focused on economic development aspects. They focus on supply chain, workforce, port development, and marine transportation. One of the findings and lessons from that working group and part of the roadmap development is that innovation is really key to economic development in offshore wind, and particularly innovation that is paired with the path to commercialization that can support the mammoth scale of the offshore wind industry. So our roadmap expert working group is identifying that as a key area for innovation and for offshore wind, and to unlock the economic development potential for the state and for the region. And I think the work that NOWRDC is doing in funding these different projects that are focused on innovation and looking towards that scaling up to the future is really important to that goal.
Yeah, and I'll just add, recognizing the robust ecosystem of academic institutions and innovation hubs, as Jen mentioned, including Mass CEC. Shout out to Mass CEC for all the work they do there. That is a really critical part of New England's role in offshore wind, and somewhere that it's part of our DNA. So something that New England can really contribute to here. But what I really want to highlight here is as we are looking to develop those companies and to drive economic development in our region, one of the things that we're really focused on is making sure that we're driving equitable access to those opportunities. And some of that can be driven through policy, which we saw in Massachusetts. Law passed in August this year. We were able to pass some really great language that would drive economic inclusion in offshore wind, and it also created a program at the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center to drive equitable market and workforce development across the entire clean energy sector. And so that work is going to be really critical to make sure that we are creating equitable access to economic opportunity as we are launching this mammoth industry, as you referred to it. I like that adjective.
Excellent. Let's talk hydrogen. I know the panel is eager to get into it. We all appreciate that there are particularly hard to decarbonize sectors, marine shipping, long-haul trucking, heavy industry, where we don't have a lot of near-term solutions. And so, of course, that gets conversations really turned to hydrogen. And the interest of the intersection between hydrogen and the offshore wind emerging capacity is of high interest. Of course, it's a challenging situation because while that wind will be available on high wind and low demand days, it may not be available on other days on a consistent basis. So my question to the panel is how are you thinking about the role of offshore wind in generating hydrogen, and also what are some of the technical challenges involved for us to get from here to there?
Great. So I'll start. Thank you. So yeah, there are really some areas that will be hard to electrify. So in Massachusetts, our strategy is really to electrify as much as possible. But those areas you mentioned, like marine shipping, heavy and medium duty trucks and transport, there are some areas that are going to be harder to electrify. And so those are areas where we're interested in exploring new technologies, whether it be hydrogen, long duration storage, some technologies that we can start to further that will help achieve our goals. So in respect to green hydrogen, this is where offshore wind plays an interesting role. So we have this great resource right off of our coast, and can we use that to create green hydrogen? Massachusetts has partnered with Maine and a number of other Northeast states led by NYSERDA in a hydrogen hub application. So this is a federal funding opportunity coming out of DOE, an $8 billion funding opportunity for regional hydrogen hubs. And that is really, I think, our value proposition as a Northeast region, is being able to partner that offshore wind resource and the renewable energy resources that we have to create this green hydrogen hub. It also includes a number over, I think it's between 70 and 90 industry partners at this point and growing every day. So it's this real effort to work regionally to create kind of a hydrogen hub, bring down the cost, advance the technology on both the supply side and the demand side at the same time. So we're really interested in that pursuit and looking forward to some of the research and development that will come if we are successful in working through that federal opportunity.
Not sure I have a lot to add to what Jen just said. As she mentioned, Maine is one of the partners on that regional clean hydrogen hub proposal that we are very hopeful about. We do think that there's real potential for green hydrogen paired with offshore wind, particularly floating offshore wind farms. We're seeing right next door in Atlantic Canada, there are efforts to partner with Germany, for example, to produce clean hydrogen from offshore wind projects off Atlantic Canada and then transport to Germany for use to decarbonize in the European sector. This concept's also already being explored in Europe. I believe there's a project in Belgium, the High Off Wind project, that was expected to reach financial close soon. So there are some efforts that we'll be able to learn from a bit. But we're really excited to be part of that regional effort and to consider research topics on elements like decarbonizing these sectors, but also how to do this in a safe manner.
Yeah, and I'll just add to tag on to that word safe. One of the things that we are really focused on is making sure that as we are exploring the potential for developing green hydrogen with offshore wind, making sure that it adheres to the values that I mentioned before, particularly environmental justice, because we all know that hydrogen is a highly flammable gas. And so as we are considering the production of it, making sure that we're also considering where that is being stored and making sure that it is safe. There are a number of environmental justice communities that have concerns about hydrogen being stored near their communities. So that's something that we are definitely focused on. But that being said, ELM does recognize the need and opportunity for green hydrogen, but particularly focused on those hard to decarbonize sectors. There are a number of sectors that would be much more efficiently and cost effectively decarbonized through electrification, and so we will continue to push that and really appreciate the states working towards trying to figure out this side of things for hydrogen to drive the decarbonization of those resources that can't be easily electrified.
I'm so glad that, starting with Jen, you talked about the Northeast Hydrogen Hub. And for those of you who don't track the Washington development super closely, the bipartisan infrastructure law included, that Congress passed and the President signed, included $8 billion to fund, I think they're talking 6 to 10 regional hydrogen hubs across the country. And the basic concept is to inspire kind of a soup to nuts ecosystem, from the generation of hydrogen to the processing of it, to the transportation and distribution of it, and then to end use within a given region. And so that competition is underway. I guess concept papers are due soon.
The original concept papers were submitted, and we'll
That's
find
right.
out in December, and then the final applications will be due in April. Yeah.
That's right. So the DOE is inserted a concept paper round, and they're going to, the evaluators will encourage or discourage proposals from going forward. And so that'll be a very critical round. And there's easily a dozen or more exciting collaborations across the country gearing up to, that have submitted concept papers. I guess the point that I want to make is that the Northeast Hydrogen Hub is probably the best positioned to be able to include offshore wind in its proposal, in the Hydrogen Hub proposal, because of how advanced our projects are here. So let's move on to transmission. And really, there's a robust discussion, debate, thinking about how to design a transmission system to accommodate offshore wind, with the initial dozen or so wind farms that have received state awards were included proposals to send a direct Gen lead line to shore just to serve that one offshore wind farm. Increasingly, we're appreciating that our existing onshore grid is going to have trouble accommodating the full 30 gigawatts and beyond. And so there's a lot of discussion about developing a transmission mesh grid and designing things on both the wet and the dry side of transmission. So in the context of offshore wind, invite any of the panelists to share how you're thinking about offshore wind transmission and any activities that you're involved in to advance that work.
Should we mix it up? I'll start this time. So transmission, we definitely see transmission as a really key solution to unlocking offshore wind for New England, as well as to helping bring it to scale, as Kevin mentioned. Some of the innovations that could be possible are figuring out ways to really maximize energy on the lines so that we're optimizing this technology and minimizing impacts to wildlife and the environment, but also to communities. If we're thinking about this scale of offshore wind of potentially 30 to maybe even 50 gigawatts in New England by 2050, that's a lot of interconnection points. And we have a limited number of areas where interconnection is feasible, but that also implies impacts on communities on the coast. And so making sure that we are figuring out ways to innovate and maximize the power that we're transporting and plugging into the grid will help minimize those impacts. So that's one thing that we're really focused on. And I'll just highlight, I know Stephanie mentioned it, but one of the key pieces of this issue as well that's non-technical but still super important is this regional collaboration. New England has a regional grid, and so it really behooves the states to collaborate, particularly on this issue. And I want to recognize the 5 New England states that issued a request for information, an RFI, on September 1st, I think it was, for regional transmission solutions for offshore wind. And we're really interested to see that continue to move forward. The Department of Energy released a funding opportunity with the Grid Innovation Program a few weeks ago, and is requesting concept papers from states for those projects by January 13th. So it's go time to get those applications in to be able to get the federal funding, and continuing to move that process forward to secure the federal funding and to keep the states working together is really going to be a critical aspect to making sure that transmission will help us bring this offshore wind industry to scale. And as Kevin mentioned, one of those things that we're really aiming for, that New England for Offshore Wind is really focused on, is that dream of a networked offshore grid that could be, not only a tool for New England to unlock offshore wind, but could also potentially help with interregional planning and get to a macro grid for the United States to increase reliability and decrease costs.
Great. Just to add a little bit to what Susannah was just describing, Maine, through our Maine Offshore Wind Roadmap, has identified regional collaboration as a really important part of our efforts to pursue activities in offshore wind and how to maximize the opportunities for the whole region of New England. One of the things we have partnered on is this New England regional RFI on transmission, and we're learning quite a lot from the responses to that. There are a lot of R&D needs that have been articulated, I think, that can help move this ball forward. Those include pieces like how to identify the most appropriate corridors for a networked offshore transmission system, how to minimize the impacts during installation, and how to future-proof for sequenced input increases as well as reliability. In Maine, we are very cognizant of all the potential impacts of offshore wind, and we are also working really hard to be proactive and regionally coordinating to do the best job that we all possibly can.
So I don't have too much to add. I will say, the first couple of projects were kind of just single line interconnection points, and then we're going to need to be at the space where we start to think about this mesh network, the HVDC with the larger distances. How can we optimize the interconnection points and really the flexibility with these projects and between the different farms that will be established. So that, in addition to kind of the land side upgrades that will need to be done. So there's quite a bit, and we're really just excited to partner with our other states in the region, but more regional collaboration and federal collaboration is certainly going to be needed to get us there. Yeah.
Thank you. We're actually heading into the last few minutes of our session, and just wanted to ask the panel, you can use this time to make any closing remarks you want to make, but I'm also curious, are there any R&D priorities that we haven't talked about that you are focused on, both technical and non-technical, that we haven't touched on? So the microphone is yours. Maybe start again down.
Sure, yeah. I think one of the things that we haven't talked about that I want to highlight, that I know now RDC has had a role to play in, is supply chain development and safety, two very critical concerns for our labor community as we're developing offshore wind. You know, this, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, this is a really enormous opportunity for the creation of high quality jobs, and we need to continue to make sure that we are finding ways to make it as safe as possible for those workers. And the development of supply chain is also really critical, and something that requires coordination beyond just the New England region, because we need to be thinking about the supply chain as a domestic supply chain. And as all of us know from the last couple of years, developing that domestic supply chain is critical to make sure that we don't have situations that we had with other industries across, and still are having across the country. And you know, developing that supply chain will help make sure that we're not just insulating ourselves from supply chain shocks globally, but that we're also reducing costs, because you know, developing all of the components and shipping all of them across the ocean is fairly expensive. So developing the supply chain is not only going to be critical to creating those high quality jobs here, but also continuing to drive down costs, which will help ensure that offshore wind can be brought to scale.
And I just want to take a moment to highlight the importance of the non-technical challenges to offshore wind. In the U.S., BOEM is increasingly recognizing the importance of these challenges and the lease stipulations that they are putting forward, as well as the multi-factor bidding criteria, trying to be proactive about finding solutions to ocean use conflicts, environmental protection, workforce shortages, and supply chain bottlenecks. NOWRDC has a really important role to play in this space in terms of helping to advance technological solutions to these non-technical challenges. I just wanted to highlight a couple of example NOWRDC funded projects that address some of the potential conflict issues. So there's the NREL project on shared mooring system designs for floating offshore wind. There's also the University of Maine project that looks at synthetic mooring lines semi-taut to reduce the spatial footprint on the seafloor to minimize interactions with existing ocean users. There's also an autonomous technology project that looks at monitoring protected marine mammals in a safe and non-disturbing way from sail drones. So these are all different projects that NOWRDC has funded that are helping advance the technological solutions to non-technical challenges to offshore wind.
I have already talked a little bit about monitoring and the importance of monitoring as these projects start to get deployed, and that will really help to inform policy and really help us understand the successes, the challenges, and where policy needs to be improved. But I also think another area we didn't touch on is our ports and infrastructure. So our ports here tend to be quite a bit smaller than they're used to in the European sector. And we have other things to deal with. We have height restrictions with bridges, we have some hurricane barriers, the Jones Act. So there's certainly more innovation that's needed for turbine deployment logistics, solutions such as feeder barges and vessel operations. So there's a lot more that I think we can learn from with these first projects and start to improve upon in that area. But I would just say it's a really interesting and exciting time. I'm really thrilled to just be here at this moment in this intersection, and there's quite a bit to do. There's quite a bit from both the Massachusetts climate laws that have been adopted 2 years back to back, but also the federal government Inflation Reduction Act and bipartisan infrastructure law has brought about a lot of funding and attention to this area. So really working in partnership with NOWRDC and our academic institutions on research and collaboration is going to be critically important to getting us to our goals. So thank you all for the invitation to be here today and the work that you do.
Well, thank you, panelists. This has been a marvelous discussion, very engaging. We're going to go to a break in a second, and I trust that our panelists would, since we denied you the opportunity to ask some questions from the floor, we can linger for a few minutes to receive any questions. Please join me in thanking the panel. Okay, so 15-minute break, and then we're going to, the O&M session will be in this room The fixed structure engineering session is going to be in the Egan Research Center, which is, as you go out the door, you'll see that green common. It's on the far side of the common. So please take a break and come to your sessions on time. Thank you.